All right, so we've taken a look at two main topics in connection with the introduction to the fundamentals of ethics. In the introduction, as we've seen, Schaefer-Landau spends a good bit of time on the issue of morality and knowledge and different philosophical premises about moral knowledge. We talked about the objectivist view, and we talked about the non-objectivist view, and we looked at arguments for non-objectivism. And so we spent a good bit of time on that issue of moral knowledge, or at least the possibility of moral knowledge. And then we saw the other main topic in the introduction to the fundamentals of ethics was basics of logic. And we've covered enough basics of logic now to be able to go through the arguments that are presented in the readings going forward and have a sense of some of the basic criteria that go into evaluating arguments, criteria such as validity and soundness. You have some understanding now of what it means to distinguish between the correctness of the reasoning in the argument on the one hand, and on the other hand, the truth or the falsity of the statements in the argument. So now let's turn to the first reading selection, the first chapter that we have after the introduction. We're going to turn now to a specific theory of value, a specific theory about what is good. Ethics has mainly to do with the questions, what is right, that is to say, what in general is the right thing to do, what as a matter of principle is the right thing to do. Of course, in many particular cases, we just use our moral common sense, and I think we, in most cases, most of the time, come up with the right answer, but to this question, what is the right thing to do? But coming at it from a more philosophical point of view, what we want to try to do is identify the principle or the set of principles that helps us to make that determination in cases where it's not so easy to say, in ethical dilemmas, for example, where it's not so clear, and moral common sense doesn't necessarily lead us to a clear answer. Two people who both have moral common sense might come to a different conclusion about this issue, what is the right thing to do, in certain particular cases, in difficult cases, in the case of certain kinds of moral dilemmas. So we want to go further than just our kind of immediate intuitive judgment about what is the right thing to do. A good amount of this class will be focusing on different possible ethical principles that can help us to make that determination in cases where it is a dilemma or where it's not so clear what the right answer is. So much of ethics has to do with this question, what is right? What is the right thing to do? Again, as a matter of principle, not in any particular case, although we do look at particular cases as a way to try to assess the plausibility, the believability of certain principles that we'll consider. So much of the class will focus on this question, what is the right thing to do? What is right? And ethics also focuses on this question, what is good? And that's the focus now of the rest of this first unit of the course. We'll take up one specific value theory, one theory about what is good, what truly is good, in the philosophical sense of what is the good. Sometimes the way philosophers make this distinction or explain the broader philosophical question is to make the distinction between the question, what is good, and on the other hand, the question, what is the good? So when it comes to this question, what is good, of course, we can all think of lots of examples. Good movies, good baseball players, good cars, good traits of character, a good hammer, a good knife, any number of contexts, right, in which we apply this basic evaluative term good or its opposed term bad. We use this distinction good bad all the time in all kinds of contexts. Good painting, good sculpture, good book, right? So we can think of lots of examples of particular good things. That's not so hard. But the interesting philosophical question would be this: is there something that all particular good things have in common that explains why they are good? I just gave a long list of examples: good hammer, good knife, good movie, good sculpture, good painting, good car, good friend, right? Any number of contexts in which you apply these terms, good and bad. And at first glance, it would seem like that's such a mix of examples, right? That's such a heterogeneous mix of things. At first glance, they would appear not to have anything in common. So it's a little bit of a mystery how we can use this same evaluative term to apply to such a disparate, such a diverse mix of things, isn't it? So it's an interesting philosophical question, isn't it? Is there some one source of all value? Is there something that is the good, that is the source of all goodness, the source of all value? And that's a different question from what are examples of particular good things. Obviously, it's not hard to answer that question. But with respect to this more profound philosophical question, what is the good? That's an old philosophical question, and there's no simple answer to that question. We'll consider one theory, hedonism. That's the topic of this first chapter that we're reading now, that presents an answer to that question, or attempts to provide an answer to that question. So let's take a look at hedonism as a theory of value. When it comes to doing value theory, when it comes to thinking critically about questions of what is good, and again, this broader philosophical question, what is the good? There are some very basic distinctions that we have to make, basic conceptual distinctions, basic philosophical distinctions. One common philosophical distinction when it comes to talking about values, that is to say ways that things can be good, is to make the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental values. And Schaefer-Landau, early on in the chapter, spends a good bit of time on this distinction. So let me just review it for you and elaborate on it a little bit. To say that something has intrinsic value is to say that it's good for its own sake. We just want it for itself. We just want it for its own sake. We don't want it as a means to anything else. By way of contrast, if something is an instrumental value, then when we're saying that it's good, we mean that it's good as a means to something else. So it's not so hard to come up with examples of instrumental values. There are many things that we want not for themselves, but simply as a means to something else. So what would be some standard examples, some stock examples of instrumental values? Well, money, for example. Most of us don't want money for itself. We simply want it as a means to other valuable things. So nice house, nice car, nice bike, what have you. We don't really care about the money in and of itself. It's just paper and metal. Maybe some people do, like people who collect coins or something like that, or collect currency as a kind of hobby. They might just want it for its own intrinsic value. Maybe it's a historical value, or its aesthetic value. But for most of us, we simply see money as having intrinsic value. We don't really want it for itself. We want it as a means to other valuable things that we can get with it. Medicine is a common example of an instrumental value. We don't take medicine for its own sake. In many cases, of course, medicine is very unpleasant. But it is good in what sense? Well, in the sense of being instrumentally good. It is valuable in what sense? In the sense of being instrumentally valuable. It's a means to something else, namely to one's health, to restoring one's health when one is sick, for example. That's why we want medicine. It is good, but it's not good in the same sense that health is good. Health we just want for its own sake. Medicine we don't want for its own sake. If we could get healthy in some way that didn't involve having to take unpleasant medicine, then we wouldn't take it. It is good, but it's only good as an instrumental value. It's only good as a means to something else. Another common example of an instrumental value would be power, say for example, political power or power in a company or a corporation, something like that. Here again, some people, of course, who pursue power get very wrapped up in that. People who pursue political power, for example, that's their big thing. That's what they're all wrapped up in, and that's their big thing. But I think for most of us, we just see power as something that has instrumental value. If we rise in some company or corporation or some other kind of institution like a college or university, something like that, if we rise into positions that come with a certain measure of power, I think most of us see that as simply, again, a means to do good things. We can use the power to help people, we can use the power to improve things in one way or another, but I think most of us would see it as unhealthy to be too preoccupied with the pursuit of power for its own sake. I mean, to really make that into a kind of intrinsic value, something that you just want for its own sake, and something that motivates you or drives you. I think most of us would see that as unhealthy. I think most of us see power as just having instrumental value. Insofar as we do pursue it, we pursue it for the good things that we can do with it. So those would be some common examples of instrumental values. What would be some examples of intrinsic values? Well, that's a harder philosophical question to answer, but hedonism is one attempt to give an answer to that question. According to hedonism, happiness is the good. That is to say, happiness is the source of all value. Happiness is the one intrinsic value. Now, that's an interesting philosophical question. Is there only one intrinsic value, or is there more than one intrinsic value? There's no simple answer to that question. It seems like happiness is an intrinsic value. That seems uncontroversial. It seems clear that most people want it for its own sake, not as a means to anything else. But is it the only intrinsic value? That's a further philosophical question, and right now we're just focusing on this one theory of value, hedonism, but next time we'll take a look at some criticisms of hedonism as a theory of value. Many philosophers have rejected it as a theory of value, and oftentimes people reject it because they don't believe that happiness is the only intrinsic value. It may be the case that other things are intrinsically valuable, even if they do not intend to promote happiness. So that's a further philosophical question. We'll come to that next time, but right now let's just focus on what the hedonist theory of value is. According to that theory, happiness is the one intrinsic value. And all other good things derive their goodness from their tendency to promote pleasure or happiness. Here again, I'm using the terms pleasure and happiness interchangeably for our purposes here. Some hedonists have explained the theory as the good is pleasure. Some have put the point in a slightly different way and said that the one intrinsic value, the good, is happiness. So I'm just going to use those terms interchangeably for our purposes. So Schaefer-Landau discusses a couple important thinkers, a couple important philosophers in this tradition in the chapter, beginning with an ancient philosopher. Epicurus lived in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, 341 to 270. He was an ancient Greek philosopher, and historically this was the beginning of hedonism as a theory of value. So it's an old theory. It's been around a long time. It's been around for about just as long as philosophy itself has been around. Very early in the history of philosophy, different philosophers began to debate this question: what truly is good? What is the good? And hedonism was one of the first theories developed, and criticisms of hedonism are just as old. So hedonism as a theory and criticisms of hedonism as a theory of value have been around a long time, pretty much go back to the earliest period of philosophy. And it's an old theory because it has a certain amount of common sense appeal. At least at first glance, it certainly sounds believable. It certainly sounds plausible, at least at first glance. Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher, was the first to make this argument that the good is pleasure. Pleasure understood broadly, not just in the sense of physical pleasure, and in fact, physical pleasures are not even the most important kind of pleasure when it comes to this theory of value hedonism. But pleasure understood broadly to include pleasures of the mind and social pleasures. Pleasure is the good. That is the source of all value. Anything that is good because in one way or another it tends to promote pleasure or tends to promote happiness. Here again, Epicurus attached the greatest value to intellectual pleasures, that is to say, pleasures of the mind, and social pleasures, such as those of friendship. He attached little importance to physical pleasure. So it's something of a historical irony that the term Epicurean now, which you do see from time to time, has connotations to do with physical pleasure. So if you come across the word Epicurean, oftentimes it's used in connection with giving a lot of attention to fine food, giving a lot of value to exotic food, eating well, being able to appreciate fine cuisine and fine wines and so forth. Oftentimes the word Epicurean comes up in that kind of a context. So in terms of the modern English word, oftentimes it is associated with physical pleasure. But historically that's ironic. There's an irony to that because Epicurus is the philosopher. His name is the source of that word, and he actually gave very little importance to physical pleasure. He actually ate a very simple diet. He didn't really live on much more than just bread and cheese and wine. So he believed in, when it comes to the physical pleasures, being very moderate, and he did not think it was important that you have fine food or exotic food or gourmet food, anything like that. He actually lived very, very simply. So there's something of a historic irony in that fact about him. But Epicurus attached, again, the most importance to pleasures of the mind and to social pleasures. Again, by social pleasures, we would mean the pleasure of friendship, for example, or maybe more broadly, the pleasure of being engaged in your community, trying to make your community a better place, being engaged with your fellow citizens and so forth in constructive ways. Pleasures of the mind, here again, any kind of pleasure that challenges your intellect, that makes demands on your intellectual powers, the pleasures associated with solving problems in math or logic, or just figuring out how to fix something could be a kind of intellectual pleasure. The kind of gratification that comes from knowing how something works and being able to figure out how to fix it, or how to build something, or the kinds of challenges that come up in engineering, how to get around a certain logistical problem or engineering problem, all kinds of different ways that we use our intellect. Maybe the kind of intellectual pleasure of solving a mystery, maybe in the case of reading a mystery novel, something like that, being able to figure out who did it. All kinds of ways in which we get pleasure from using our minds. And Epicurus attached the most importance to those kinds of pleasures of the mind. As Schaefer-Landau points out, according to Epicurus, the most pleasurable state is to be in a state of freedom from disturbance. The Greek term is autarkia. And by that, Epicurus thought that the highest pleasure is to be in a state of calm, serenity, equanimity, to use different words for the same basic idea, not being agitated, not being agitated or distracted by mundane kind of worldly affairs, but having a sense of inner peace, having peace of mind. Epicurus really saw that as the one truly happy state. Epicurus put the point this way by saying, we recognize pleasure as the first good innate in us. And from pleasure we begin every act of choice and avoidance. And to pleasure we return, using the feeling as the standard by which we judge every good. So the Epicureans believed, hedonists generally believe, that here again, every particular good thing is good because in one way or another it tends to promote pleasure, tends to conduce to happiness, and that's why we call it good, because as Epicurus says here, the desire for pleasure is innate in us. This term innate means inborn. Something that is innate in you is just in you by your very human nature. It's already in you the moment you come into existence. It's not acquired. You acquire the ability, well, I shouldn't say you acquire the ability. The ability for language is arguably innate as well, but you acquire competence in the use of language, obviously from exposure to it, say, for example. Or you acquire competence in using the scientific method of trial and error by learning, through experience. There are lots of things that we learn to do on the basis of our experiences, but then there are some things that are just in us innately as soon as we come into existence. And that's what philosophers mean by something being innate here. The root of that word, NAT, you see that same root in words that have to do with being born, like natal or prenatal or natal ward, say for example in the hospital where they keep the babies, or prenatal care, things that mothers should do to have a healthy baby before the baby is born, or you see that same root NAT in nativity, such as a nativity scene depicting the birth of Jesus, say for example. So this philosophical word innate means in us in you as soon as you're born. And Epicurus is saying that the desire for pleasure, the kind of impetus, the kind of drive, the kind of impulse that we have in the direction of what is pleasurable, that's innate in us. And it's because of this innate tendency to move toward what is pleasant and to move away from what is painful. It's because of that innate tendency that we make these judgments about what is good. And here again, that it will produce pleasure or happiness is the standard that we're applying when we say that something is good. So that is the Epicurean theory of value. Epicurus believed that the key to happiness was, well, really, as Schaefer-Landau says, more than one thing. For one thing, moderation. Here again, as I mentioned a moment ago, moderation when it comes to physical pleasures. Because, as I said a moment ago, the Epicureans, and here again, hedonists generally, do not attach great value to physical pleasures. So it's very important that you be moderate in the pursuit of physical pleasures, because ultimately they're not that important. You need to focus more energy and attention on the higher pleasures. And so to achieve this truly happy state, this truly pleasurable state of atarakia, calm, serenity, equanimity, freedom from agitation, freedom from disturbance, you have to pursue physical pleasures only moderately. And then, as Schaefer-Landau also goes on to say, you have to have intellectual clarity about what is truly happy, or what truly will make you happy. Let me put the point that way. What truly is pleasurable? What truly is conducive to happiness? What truly will promote your happiness? You have to have true beliefs about that. You have to have correct beliefs about that rather than false beliefs about that. So, in the first lecture we talked about objectivism as one theory about ethical knowledge, and obviously hedonism is one example of an objectivist theory. Hedonism says that there are objectively true beliefs about what will promote happiness. And there are also false beliefs. And Epicurus believed that much of the unhappiness in the world is a consequence of the fact that people have false beliefs about happiness. They have false beliefs about what is required to be truly happy. One way that he made the point was to introduce a distinction between what he called natural desires on the one hand and what he called on the other hand vain desires. He thought that much of the unhappiness in the world was simply a consequence of the fact that people valued the wrong things. They valued things that will not truly make you happy. They value things that will not truly promote happiness. Many people have mistaken beliefs about what is needed for happiness, and he thought that that was the source of much of the unhappiness in the world. Here again, he has to say something about that, doesn't he? He has to have some kind of philosophical answer to that question, because we just said a moment ago that the desire for pleasure, the desire for happiness, is innate in every human being. So that's one of his basic philosophical claims. That's a basic philosophical thesis of Epicurus, as we've seen. So when you hear that, a natural question to ask is then, why are so many people unhappy? If it's just a matter of following an innate natural impulse, it seems like it should just then be automatically something that shouldn't be too hard to achieve, right? Well, that impulse has to be guided, Epicurus would say. That impulse has to be guided by true beliefs. But oftentimes, people's beliefs about what will make them happy, their beliefs are false. Such false beliefs are based on what he called vain desires. So, the desire for wealth, for example, is what Epicurus would call a vain desire. It's not a natural desire. And what he meant by this distinction between natural desires and vain desires would be this. When it comes to a natural desire, there's kind of, one way that he made the point was to say there's kind of a built-in limit to that. So, the desire for food, of course, is natural. Without that desire, we wouldn't stay alive for very long, obviously. But once you're full, then that desire has hit its limit, right? You don't want food anymore once you're not hungry anymore. So that's a kind of natural desire. The problem with many beliefs about happiness, the problem with these vain desires, according to Epicurus, is that there's no natural limit to them. So if somebody believes that wealth is the most important thing to happiness, the problem is there's no natural limit, no limit built in to human nature. There's no natural limit to how much wealth you can pursue, how much wealth you can acquire. And because there's no natural limit, if somebody mistakenly believes, if someone falsely believes that wealth is necessary or the most important thing to happiness, then they will just pursue more and more and more wealth. There's no real built-in natural limit in the way that there is, again, with the desire for food. You're not hungry anymore, okay, now you don't desire it. There's a kind of built-in natural limit to natural desires. But there's no natural limit to the desire for wealth. Wealth is not, money is not in us by nature. It's a social convention. It's something that we invented. It's not in us innately. And there's no natural limit to it. And of course, many people pursue wealth to the neglect or to the detriment of the pursuit of other values, such as, here again, for Epicurus, what would be most important would be pleasures, intellectual pleasures, pleasures associated with the mind. Many people pursue wealth to the neglect of the cultivation of their minds. Here again, we saw for Epicurus, social pleasures are very important, such as the pleasure of friendship. Many people pursue wealth to the detriment of friendships, to the neglect of the good of friendship. So if somebody becomes wrapped up in wealth, and other examples would be the desire for power. Here again, many people get wrapped up in that. The desire for fame. Here again, that's a vain desire as well. According to Epicurus, these are some standard kinds of Epicurean examples. The argument would be the same in every case. There's no natural limit. If you think power is the most important thing to happiness, then you will just pursue more and more power in an obsessive kind of way, right? If you think fame, here again, is important or the most important thing to happiness, then you'll just pursue more and more and more. There isn't any built-in point at which you'll be satisfied. Here again, with respect to natural desires, there is kind of a kind of built-in point at which now you're satisfied. So let's think of the example of intellectual pleasures. Here again, maybe the intellectual pleasure that comes from solving a problem. It can be any kind of problem, a problem in science, a problem in math, or logic, or just the problem of solving a mystery in reading a mystery novel or something like that, or solving some problem in architecture, how to construct something, how to build something, or solving some mechanical problem, how to fix something. Any kind of pleasure that engages your mind, any kind of pleasure that engages your intellect. Once you've solved the problem, then you would achieve a certain state of satisfaction. And of course, that doesn't last forever. You go on to pursue other intellectual pleasures as well. But you do kind of have that moment of satisfaction. You do have a kind of natural built-in period of, okay, where now you can just kind of pause and take gratification in the fact that you exercised your intellect. There's a kind of natural resting point there. With respect to the vain desires here again, there isn't any such built-in natural limit. That's why people who get wrapped up in power, people who get wrapped up in wealth, that's their main thing, they tend not to be happy because they neglect sources of more truly valuable goods. One way that Epicurus put the point was to say that nature has made what is necessary easy to supply, and what is not easy unnecessary. So an awful lot of false beliefs about happiness could simply be corrected by understanding that if it's not easy to acquire, then you probably don't need it to be happy. Let's go back to the standard examples of vain desires. Wealth. Is great wealth easy to acquire? No, it takes a lot of time and effort, obviously. But, according to Epicurus, it's not easy to acquire because it's not necessary. Nature has made what is necessary, that is to say, what is necessary to true happiness, what is necessary to true pleasure. Nature has made what is necessary easy to supply. You don't really need that much. You don't need some extravagant amount of wealth to be happy. It's not easy to acquire, but guess what? You also don't need it. Same goes for power. Is great power easy to acquire? No, it requires a lot of time and effort. But guess what? From the fact that it's not easy to acquire, you know, according to Epicurus anyway, you know that it's not important to happiness. It's not necessary for happiness. If it were necessary for happiness, then nature would have made it easy to acquire, easy to supply. Some people get wrapped up in fame. Here again, another of Epicurus's vain desires. Is great fame, is worldwide fame necessary for happiness? According to Epicurus, no. Is great fame, kind of worldwide fame, is that easy to acquire? No. Here again, that would require an awful lot of time and effort to achieve that kind of status, wouldn't it? It's not easy to acquire, is it? But you know what? According to Epicurus, it's not necessary to happiness. You can tell that it's not necessary from the fact that it's not easy to acquire. Nature has made what is necessary to happiness easy to supply. It doesn't cost anything to use your mind. You can go to the library and read a book for free. It doesn't cost anything to read a book. So many ways that we can use our mind cost nothing at all. Using your mind is free. When it comes to food, here again, exotic food, gourmet food, very fine food, that's expensive, but here again, according to Epicurus, from the fact that it's not easy to acquire, you know that it's not necessary for happiness. You can be quite happy eating simply, and simple food is pretty easy to acquire. So nature has made what is necessary easy to supply, and what is not easy unnecessary. Schaefer-Landau also discusses the 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill. In terms of hedonism as a value theory, Epicurus was the most influential thinker in the ancient world. And in terms of the modern world, the most influential proponent, the most influential supporter of hedonism as a value theory would be John Stuart Mill, the 19th century British philosopher. As Schaefer-Landau discusses, Mill, like Epicurus, gave great importance to intellectual pleasures, what he called artistic pleasures or creative pleasures, social pleasures, here again, like the pleasures associated with friendship or engagement in your community. Like Epicurus, he also gave little importance to the pleasures of sensual gratification, that is to say, to physical pleasures. I said a moment ago that hedonism is an old value theory. It goes back to really the earliest period of philosophy. It's an old debate. How ought we to live? This is one of the foundational questions of ethics. And even in the ancient world, even in the very early periods of philosophy, philosophers took different approaches to that question. One common answer to that question would be along the lines of what we've seen in Epicurus. One ought to live for pleasure. One ought to live for happiness. That's how we ought to live. Other philosophers were critical, though, of hedonism as a value theory. And as I said a moment ago, here again, we'll talk about some of the criticisms next time. But just to finish that thought, other critics of hedonism as a value theory would say, no, one ought to live for, and then there would be different candidates proposed, different values proposed for what is most important in life. But not everybody agrees that happiness is the most important values, the highest good, that it's what we ought primarily to strive for. So ancient philosophers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle would argue that one ought to live for virtue. One ought to live for one ought to live in such a way as to achieve such virtues of character as wisdom, or one ought to live for knowledge, the use of the mind, and the employment of the mind to discover. This ought to be the highest goal in life, even to the detriment of one's own happiness. If the devotion to knowledge is ultimately important, then it may even be more important than one's own personal pleasure or satisfaction or gratification or fulfillment. So this is an old question, and as I've kind of indicated here, just as hedonism is an old theory of value, criticisms of it have been around just as long. And Schaefer-Landau spends some time on this criticism of hedonism that was posed to John Stuart Mill and to Mill's reaction to it, or his reply to the various critics of hedonism. Mill wrote, it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And what he was replying to here was a common criticism of hedonism in his time, that to live for pleasure is not really becoming for human beings. It's not really a form of life or an overarching goal of life that is the appropriate goal for human beings, because human beings are capable of striving for other things than pleasure. Some critics would argue that, animals can live their lives for pleasure, but human beings are not mere animals. We have higher capacities to live for other things, the ability to pursue other goals and other virtues and other values and other goods than just our own satisfaction or pleasure. So as some critics put the point, this is a swinish philosophy. It's a philosophy that's only worthy of pigs. You know, if the most important thing in life were pleasure, then apparently a pig rolling around in the mud could have the best life. But most of us think that that's not the best life. There's something more virtuous and something more valuable about employing the abilities, the capacities that human beings have for achieving other things just besides their own gratification, their own pleasure or happiness. So that was the criticism to the effect that hedonism is only a philosophy fit for pigs. It's not a philosophy fit for humans. Humans are capable of aspiring for greater things than just their own pleasure. So that's what Mill was driving at. in offering this critical reaction to that argument. He acknowledges that simply from the point of view of pleasure, a pig, which of course does not strive to achieve a lawful lot in the way of, here again, what we've called intellectual pleasures, artistic pleasures. You don't see pigs painting or creating sculptures or composing poetry or engaging in science or anything like that. So you don't see them really focused on intellectual and artistic pleasures. Only human beings engage in those, obviously. And Mill is acknowledging here that it's very easy, of course, for an animal to be satisfied because animals are only capable of striving for pleasure. That is true. But what he's driving at here is that it's true that if you strive for intellectual achievement, if you strive for artistic achievement, then those efforts, of course, are going to be accompanied by dissatisfaction, by setbacks, by frustration, by disappointments, by failures. And of course, those are not happy experiences. And so the critic would say, if hedonism were true, then we should just aim for the pleasures that are easiest to achieve, just raw physical pleasure. But look, that's the kind of life that a pig leads. That wouldn't be appropriate. That wouldn't be a life that is becoming or befitting a human being. Human beings have more dignity than just to live for pleasure. So in this quote, Mill is acknowledging that it's better to be a human being who is engaging his intellectual powers and abilities at a very high level, like, say, for example, the ancient philosopher Socrates, and to suffer some measure of dissatisfaction, than to simply strive for base pleasures, low pleasures, like physical pleasures, and be satisfied with those. So what Mill is driving at here is that hedonism is consistent with the idea that we have to strive for higher things than just physical pleasure. But of course, the hedonists have always said that, would be Mill's point. Hedonism has never said that one ought to strive only for low, base, physical pleasures, the pleasures of sensual gratification. Of course, hedonists have never said that. So Mill's kind of critical reply to this argument, in so many words, is that it rests on a misunderstanding of what hedonism has historically said. I'll talk about Mill's ideas in a little bit more depth in the next lecture. After his discussion of Epicurus's ideas and John Stuart Mill's ideas, Schaeffer Landau gives a number of considerations that seem to support the plausibility, the believability of hedonism as a theory of value. I'm just going to follow his organization now. He offers a number of considerations. There are many models of a good life. Hedonism recognizes our personal authority over our own well-being. Misery clearly hampers a good life, and happiness clearly improves it. Hedonism makes sense of the limits of explanation. Hedonism makes sense of the fact that there are exceptions to the rules of a good life. And hedonism explains why happiness is what we want for our loved ones. So all of these claims, all of these considerations seem to support hedonism as a theory of value. Here again, hedonism is the thesis that the happiness is the good. Pleasure or happiness is the source of all value, and everything is good. Every particular thing is good because in one way or another it tends to promote happiness or pleasure. So to follow up a little bit on this idea that there are many models of a good life, hedonism recognizes that there are many paths to achieving a good life, since what makes us happy varies from person to person. And many people consider this flexibility a strength of hedonism. As a value theory, it doesn't prescribe one specific activity that everyone must pursue in order to have a good life. So in this section of the chapter, Schaeffer Landau discusses the point that other ancient philosophers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle would argue that only philosophy is a truly the life of philosophical inquiry and the life of philosophical dialectic, engagement in philosophical debates, and so forth. Only the life of philosophy, very specifically, is a truly good life, because that is the only life that fully engages the mind. So, as Schaefer-Landau points out, that has seemed to many a rather elitist view of what makes for a good life. Hedonism is more flexible than that. It's true. It recognizes that there are many paths to achieving a good life, because what makes us happy varies from person to person. A life devoted to philosophy, or other kinds of intellectual activities, physical sciences, a life devoted to physics or chemistry or biology, what have you, or other kinds of ways of engaging the intellect, a life devoted to solving engineering problems or logistical problems or public policy problems, any number of ways. There are any number of forms of life in which you can engage your intellectual capacities at a very high level. So there are going to be many lives on this theory of value. There are going to be many lives that count as good lives. And that seems more democratic. That seems not so elitist as to say there's only one specific there's only one specific form of life that could count as a truly good life. Certainly, this would be true at the level of physical pleasures, right? So it shouldn't be any surprise that this should also be true with respect to the higher pleasures. What counts as an artistic pleasure or an intellectual pleasure or a social pleasure for one individual is going to be different from another, just as what counts as physical pleasures. Here again, those are going to vary from one person to another, of course. Carolyn thinks that the best food is celery. Celery is Carolyn's favorite food. That's an unusual choice for best food. I don't think most people would say that the food that gives them the most pleasure is celery, but that is her favorite. And similarly, with respect to intellectual pleasures, of course, it's going to be different. Social pleasures, creative pleasures, pleasures of the mind, artistic pleasures, as Mill calls them. One can pursue these in any number of forms of life that can vary quite a bit. So hedonism seems to have this flexibility to it, and many have seen this flexibility as a strength of hedonism. Hedonism recognizes our personal authority over our own well-being. That is to say, hedonism has the consequence that you have a substantial say in what makes for a good life in your own case. And this has been regarded as a strength of the theory by those who are inclined to think that the individual himself or herself is best positioned to know what kind of life will be a happy one in his or her own case. So, as Schaefer-Landau goes on to observe, we dislike paternalism. We dislike being told by somebody else that they know better than we do what will be a happy life for us. We all resent that. Why is that? Because you believe that you are the best authority when it comes to what will make for a good life in your own case. And here again, hedonism recognizes that personal authority. Here again, within certain parameters. Here again, hedonism is, as we've seen, it is committed to certain basic premises, such as that intellectual pleasures and artistic and social pleasures, pleasures of the mind, pleasures of the imagination, pleasures that engage the higher human faculties. These are the most important ones. These are the ones that you have to focus on. But having said that, here again, you are the person who is best qualified to know what forms of these higher pleasures are most valuable or most rewarding for you. So hedonism recognizes that you are the best judge of what will make for a good life in your own case. Schaefer-Landau goes on to observe that misery clearly hampers a good life, and happiness clearly improves a life. He offers this thought experiment. If two lives are the same in every other respect, but the first has happiness while the second doesn't, that makes the first life the one that virtually everyone would choose. Here again, imagine two lives. Imagine that somehow you could be behind a veil of ignorance before you came into existence, and God tells you, here are two possible lives, you can have one of them. They're going to be exactly the same in every way, except in the first one, there will be happiness. In the second one, You're going to have all the same experiences. The life will be made up of all the same events, but for whatever reason, you won't derive any happiness from any of these events or from any of these experiences. Which life do you want? Well, I think virtually everyone would say the first. I haven't had any students who would seriously maintain that they would choose the second. So that thought experiment seems to show that, as Schaefer-Landau points out, happiness does improve a life, and misery clearly makes a life worse. So that seems to point to the plausibility, the believability, the credibility of hedonism as a theory of value. Again, hedonism is the thesis that happiness is the good is pleasure, the good is happiness. And so that's the ultimate standard by which we make our choices, by which we ought to make our choices. Here again, keeping in mind Epicurus's belief and Mill's belief that you have to, of course, have true beliefs about what counts as a truly happy life. And of course, as we've seen, a lot of people don't. Or at least that is Epicurus's view, and that would be Mill's view. Hedonism makes sense of the limits of explanation. What does Schaefer-Landau mean by that? That happiness increases one's well-being is basic. That is to say, that's a fundamental observation. It doesn't get any more basic than that in value theory. Happiness increases one's well-being. Unhappiness diminishes one's well-being. Unhappiness reduces one's well-being. That seems about as basic as it gets. It's hard to see how you could say anything more basic than that. Happiness just does make your life better. Unhappiness just does make your life worse. So, because that's a very basic observation, that's a fundamental observation, that shows that we don't want happiness for the sake of anything else. So we've already talked about the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental values. This thought experiment here again shows that we want happiness for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. It simply is the case that happiness improves one's life. So explanations of the form, I want X for the sake of Y, come to an end with happiness. Oftentimes, I'll ask students, why are you taking this class? Well, I want the credits. Why do you want the credits? Well, I want a certain degree. Well, why do you want a certain degree? Well, I want the degree for a certain job. Why do you want the certain job? Well, I want to be able to make a good living, be able to make a good salary and buy a nice house and nice things. Why do you want all of those things? Well, because they'll make me happy, right? This form of explanation, I want X for the sake of Y, that can go on for a long time. But it can't go on forever. At some point, that form of explanation has to come to a stop. You can't go on forever saying, I want X for the sake of Y. Well, why do you want Y? Well, I want that for the sake of Z. Well, why do you want Z? Well, I want that for the sake of A. Well, why do you want A? Well, I want that for the sake of B. This can't go on forever, right? At some point, if we are to be motivated to act, this chain of reasoning has to run up against something that you just do want for its own sake, doesn't it? And happiness seems like a good candidate for where explanation comes to an end. If I then ask you at the end of that chain of reasoning, if I ask you, well, why do you want to be happy? There's not really anything that you can say, is there? Because it's not as if you want happy, at least not that takes that form, right? Because you don't want happiness for the sake of something else, the way you want those other things for the sake of something else. You just do want to be happy. It just is the case, as Schaefer-Landau contends here, that happiness makes your life better. And that's why we want it. We just do want it for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. So hedonism takes this common sense insight, this insight that when you get to happiness, you've kind of run up to the limit of explanation. There's nothing further to explain. You just do want it. And hedonism takes this common sense insight as the starting point for moral reasoning. So that's why to many people hedonism has seemed a plausible theory of value. Hedonism makes sense of the fact that there are exceptions to the rules of a good life. What makes us happy or unhappy is pretty consistent from one person to the next. But there are exceptions, and hedonism, in not laying down strict rules for what counts as a good life, recognizes the exceptional cases. So say, for example, world-class chess players study chess, practice playing chess, for sometimes 20, 21, 22 hours a day. It's a very unusual form of life, and it's a form of life that would not make most of us happy. But there are exceptions to the rules of a good life, because that individual, while that individual has a form of life that most of us would not want, that individual is engaging his capacity for intellectual pleasure, his capacity for intellectual happiness, enjoyment, fulfillment, satisfaction, gratification. That individual is achieving those pleasures in a very intense way. Here again, at a very high level. So there are exceptions. That would not count as a good life for most of us, but there are exceptions to the rules of a good life. That's Schaefer-Landau's point. Hedonism doesn't lay down strict rules for what counts as a good life. It recognizes that there are exceptional cases, and that certainly would be an exceptional case. Most of us would not want that form of life, never doing anything but studying chess and competing in chess. But for some exceptional individuals, that could be a good life, because here again, that engages the capacity for intellectual pleasure, pleasures of the mind, pleasures of the imagination, pleasures of the intellect at a very high level. Hedonism explains why happiness is what we want for our loved ones. This is simply the observation that parents have a very strong desire that their children be happy. And Schaefer-Landau's point is that that's what we would expect if hedonism as a theory of value is true. That is certainly one of the most important things that parents want for their children. Parents want very much that their children be happy. Hedonism says that happiness is the good. The good is pleasure, is happiness. And that's what we ought to strive for. Here again, happiness understood correctly on the basis of true beliefs about happiness. If that as a value theory is true, then that explains why parents have the very strong desire that their children be happy. Now, a critical question that we could raise about this would of course be, and we'll come to this a little bit later, no doubt parents want their children to be happy, but is that what parents most want for their children? That's not so clear. That's what I think the critic of hedonism would say in reply to this point. Certainly it is true that parents have a very strong desire that their children be happy, but I don't know that it's true that that's what they most want for their children. Maybe it is, but it seems like there are candidates that you could propose that would challenge that thesis. Many parents perhaps want most of all that their children be good people, even if being a good person sometimes means sacrificing one's own happiness for the sake of some higher moral goal. Something to think about. We'll talk about Mill's ideas in a little bit more depth, and then we'll turn to some criticisms of hedonism as well.